Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to talk about the Pre-Socratics, as they are covered in the book called The First Philosophers. This is book 35 from my 2025 reading list. Well, as I started reading through Plato's dialogues, I realized that Plato was referring to ideas and philosophers that came before him. That probably should have been obvious to me, but it wasn't. I don't know if I just kind of thought Plato came up with all this stuff on his own, but he references specific philosophers and he's talking about the ideas that these philosophers had. And I came to a point in the dialogues where I just thought, I need to go back and read these people who preceded Plato. I need to see what they thought, and maybe that'll help me understand these dialogues better as well. To see what the ideas, how they generated, how they expanded before Plato, and so that was my reason for wanting to read this work and get to know some of the Pre-Socratics. And so, what the Pre-Socratics mean is just that these philosophers preceded Socrates in thought. And it doesn't mean necessarily that they preceded Socrates in time, because there is a little bit of overlap. So the period of time of the philosophers that we're talking about in that they are Pre-Socratics is between 600 and 400 BC. And Socrates lived between 469 and 399 BC. So there was a little bit of overlap, but Pre-Socratic in this sense means that we're looking at ideas that preceded Socrates in looking at philosophers that preceded Socrates in thought. So these philosophers were called Presocratics, but then also Sophists. And today I'm just going to focus on the Presocratics, and then maybe in a future episode, I'll talk about the Sophists. At a very high level, in the introduction, Robin Waterfield says the distinction between the Presocratics and the Sophists are that the Presocratics would focus on the written word and the Sophists on the spoken word. Now, that is a huge generalization, but even if you look at the Greek tragedies or even what I've read of Plato so far, you do get this sense with the Sophists that it is about dialogue, it is about speech, and that they're training others to talk and to dialogue and to give arguments and that sort of thing. And so another thing Robin Waterfield says in the introduction is that with these first philosophers, there's a shift taking place, and the shift is from mythos to logos. And so if you think of mythos as maybe the Homeric epics, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and we're going from that and we're going to logos, which Robin Waterfield calls desouled word, but then gives some general definitions for logos. It's a word that can encompass a lot of different things. So some of those words would be story, amount, value, word, speech, argument, reason, explanation. And so we're going from mythos to logos with these first philosophers between 600 and 400 BC. All of the works that we have from these philosophers are in fragments, so we don't actually have anything in its full form. And even if we did, you kind of get the idea that some of these works would have been for the purpose of teaching. So it might have been a very dense document or book, tablet, whatever they were using. It would have been more for maybe a teacher to read a part of it, and then for that to initiate a large discussion. And so the teacher would then expand upon it and that sort of thing. So even if we had the full works, they might be in a way that it'd be very weird for us to read, because that wasn't the purpose of them. And so what we have with these Pre-Socratics is since they are fragments, it's mostly other people referencing the thought of these philosophers. And so as I started with the dialogues of Plato and realized, okay, I need to look back at these people, we have a lot of fragments from Plato because Plato was referencing and quoting these philosophers. So we know their thoughts, we know some of their thinking based upon that. Aristotle quoted these guys a ton. So a lot of, and it'll say every time you come across a fragment in this particular book, it'll show where it's from. And so a lot of them are from Aristotle. There's some from Hippolytus. There's some from Plutarch, just a wide variety of sources, but they are all they would have had access to these thinkers or maybe some works that have not survived in their quoting those, and that's the ideas we're getting here. So it might be a sentence, it might be a paragraph, it might be a few paragraphs if we're very lucky, but we're kind of seeing just basic ideas, basic sentences of what these people thought. And if we take all of these fragments together for different philosophers, we can sort of get a pretty good idea of what they were thinking. Some of these philosophers, you may have heard these names before: Parmenides. There's a Plato dialogue called Parmenides, and Heraclitus, and then Pythagoras. So these are a few of the philosophers covered in this work who would be considered Pre-Socratics. Let me cover a few quotes that come from the introduction. Again, this is by Robin Waterfield, the introduction to this work, and then he compiled this book. If you listened to the episode a couple weeks ago where I covered the book Plato of Athens, that was also by Robin Waterfield. And I have some other works by Robin Waterfield coming up as well. He's done a number of different translations of Greek works and some other works as well. So neat person. I keep coming across his work more and more as I dig deeper into the Greek works. So here are some quotes from that introduction that really helped me understand the Pre-Socratics. So he says this: Pre-Socratic thought was holistic. It was an attempt to give a systematic account of the whole known universe in all its major features. End quote. So they were really trying to figure out their place in the cosmos and how everything worked together, how everything was arranged. They talked a lot about the makeup of things. So how are things put together? They talked about the soul. They talked about happiness. They talked about what level that the things were made up of, and all the way down to that of atoms. And so we really get to see some of the seeds of Plato's thought in some of the episodes where I've covered the dialogues. We see where he tries to get to the definition of thing of an idea by division. So he said, well, it's kind of like this, but then we divide that into these two things, and then we divide that into two more things, and just down the line to try to get to the essence or the definition of a thing. So you can kind of see that happening here, just at a higher level of these pre-Socratic philosophers are trying to figure out what makes a part of something into a whole. Like, what are the parts that make a whole? And so I thought that was cool, just to see how you can see that thought go right into Plato there. Let me read one other part here. So this is Robin Waterfield again. In other words, the pre-Socratic revolution was a genuine revolution, a paradigm shift of the first importance. One could say that before the Pre-Socratics, the worldview was a kind of projection. All one's awe and fears are projected outwards. It's not that I, an individual human being, am feeling awe of my own accord. It is a deity of some kind out there who is making me feel it. Then along come the Pre-Socratics and said, no, there is order in the world, and it is precisely because it is ordered that it can be comprehended by the human mind. End quote. So that's a good introduction, just kind of what they were doing there. And then a last quote here where he says, perhaps because they were the first, they can teach us something about the whole nature of human intellectual endeavor. End quote. I just like that idea. I mean, you think of the founding of philosophy, or what were they thinking about at the beginning? This is it. This is some of the first works, the first writings that we have of how people were thinking about these things. So I want to highlight just 4 of the pre-Socratic philosophers, in a few of the things that I found interesting about each of them. And then I will cover my one thing. I'm just going to do one segment in this episode and just kind of have everything together. So here are four pre-Socratic philosophers that I found to be interesting. The first is Heraclitus, and he's famous for the idea of flux rather than stability. You've heard his famous statement of, "It is impossible to step twice into the same river," and so it's just this idea of becoming rather than being. Things are in movement. There's flux rather than the stability. There's this other quote attributed to him or referenced to him in another work, and it says this: "The reason it is hard to fight against passion is that it buys what it wants at the expense of the soul." I'll say that one again. "The reason it is hard to fight against passion is that it buys what it wants at the expense of the soul." End quote. Just some deep thoughts with these philosophers, and just some nice things to think about. I found myself stopping at quite a few of the sayings in this work and just pondering them for a while, almost like a wisdom literature type of feel. The next pre-Socratic philosopher was Parmenides. We know the dialogues of Plato that reference him. He shows up in Sophists, and then he shows up in Parmenides. And so Plato is really looking at Parmenides a lot and the ideas of Parmenides. And Waterfield calls him the most important and interesting philosopher of the bunch, of the Presocratics. Then we get to Pythagoras, and he's talking a lot about the separation of the body and the soul. I found that to be interesting because we see the soul come up a lot in Plato. We see the soul come up in the dialogues dealing with the death of Socrates, and just this idea of, does the soul extend beyond the body? And you see some of these ideas popping up here with the Pre-Socratics. There's a delightful section on the number of things. And so Pythagoras, if you've heard of him, you've probably heard of him in a mathematical setting. Maybe you learn about him in elementary school or something like that. And so there's a strong mathematical component to his philosophy as well. But he would assign numbers to things, and this also kind of the Pythagorean school of thought. But they would assign numbers to things, and I thought these were quite interesting. Some said that the number of justice was 4, because being the first square number, it is divided into equal parts and is equal itself, since it is 2 times 2. Another one, since 7 neither generates any other number within the decad, nor is generated by any of them, they call it Athena. And then marriage, they said, was 5 because it is the union of male and female, and they thought that the odd was male and the even female, and 5 is the first number formed from the first even number 2, and the first odd number 3. And then the last one, opinion, they identified with 2 because it can move in 2 directions. End quote. I just like that idea of thinking about things as numbers. On the very next page, there's this. They go a little deeper into justice and inequality, but from that numerical point of view, and I thought this was interesting. So this is a little bit longer. Just stick with me on this, but I'm going to tie this to the Gulag Archipelago. So here we go. Those who do wrong are more unjust than those who suffer wrong. For the one group requires punishment, the other compensation and help. Therefore, the parts which are at a distance on the side of the obtuse angle, where the weighing instrument is concerned, and in the terms of our mathematical illustration, are progressively further away from the mean, which is justice. But the parts of the side of the acute angle will increasingly approach and come near, and as it were through continually suffering wrong and being at a disadvantage, while the others will travel downward and into corruption and immersion in evil. They will rise up and take refuge in God through their need for retribution and compensation, end quote. You see almost that exact same idea in the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn. He would compare the prisoners to the prison guards. And by all appearances, the prisoners looked like they were in the worst situation, but Solzhenitsyn said actually the prison guards were becoming like pigs. They were losing their soul in their actions. And here you've got kind of this mathematical illustration to say, while the others will travel downward and into corruption and immersion in evil. And then the other people, they will rise up. Those who are receiving the injustice, they will rise up and take refuge in God through their need for retribution and compensation, end quote. Another thought that I thought was just delightful with Pythagoras and just like the kinds of things that they were thinking about. This is so cool. So he said this, so given that the sun and moon and stars and all their quantity and enormity of size are moving at such a great speed, it is impossible, they claimed, for them not to produce an incredibly loud noise. The sound produced by the circular motion of the heavenly bodies is harmonic. End quotes. And that's quoted in Aristotle's On the Heavens. So I can't wait to read that. But that was one of the ideas, and it kind of gives you an idea for how these fragments came to us, where in this case, Aristotle's quoting this. But I love that idea, and just them thinking of, okay, if these planets and things are moving at such a great speed, wouldn't they create an incredibly loud noise? And I just thought that was kind of a fun thing that they were contemplating. All right, and the last philosopher I want to highlight here is Empedocles. And he wrote an epic verse, which is really interesting to me, because one of the distinguishing factors of philosophy is that they wrote in prose. And there was kind of this debate of what is better, poetry or prose, and we see that come up in one of the Plato dialogues where Socrates is writing in poetry. He's writing at the very end of his life. He's taking Aesop's fables and versifying them. He's turning them into verse, and so there's this idea of he spent his whole life in prose, speech, and Plato's writing down what he had said in prose format, and yet here he is delving into poetry at the end. So I just thought it was interesting that this philosopher wrote in epic verse. And then perhaps the most encouraging statement in the entire book, this was something that Robin Waterfield said. He said this about Aristotle. Aristotle was fascinated by Empedocles and referred to him more than any other pre-Socratic, but he failed to understand him, end quote. And Robin Waterfield keeps going on there to explain how he failed to understand him. But that gave me a lot of encouragement, because Plato was very hard for me. I'm looking forward to going back to Plato after having read these Presocratics and Sophists. But to hear that Aristotle had difficulty with the ideas of some of these Pre-Socratics was a great encouragement. Something that Empedocles said that I thought was really interesting is that we have two motivating factors, and those are love and strife. But the way that he defined them was what I thought was super interesting. He defined love as causes dissimilar. So love causes dissimilar things to come together. Strife causes similar things to come together. Isn't that, it's almost the opposites attract idea for love, but love causes dissimilar things to come together. Strife causes similar things to come together. You almost would think it'd be the opposite, but if you think about it, there's a lot of wisdom in those two definitions. So as for my one thing for the Pre-Socratics, the thing that stuck out to me the most in reading about them is I just thought it was so neat to start to see ideas replicated even amongst the Pre-Socratics. So the way that this book is organized, he does it in somewhat chronological order in terms of when these philosophers lived. And even within this 200-year period from 600 to 400 BC, you're starting to see ideas put forward by one philosopher, but then taken by the next philosopher and maybe added to or expanded upon. And I just thought that was so neat, because by the time you get to Plato, then he's seen what all of these people have been riffing on each other, and he gets to take it from there, and then Aristotle takes it from there, and then other philosophers take it from there. But it's also the idea of the great books. The great books are called the Great Conversation. And here you've got like a mini great conversation going on where ideas are starting to ferment, and they're starting to get in the atmosphere, and they're starting to be debated and considered and expanded on. And it was just so cool to see that in here, because it's just kind of this microcosm of the entire great books corpus and the great conversation that is going on between these works. So that's my one thing with the Pre-Socratics. And in conclusion, this is a helpful place to start before Plato. I actually bought 3 different books about the Pre-Socratics and the Sophists. So I only read part of the first one so far. So I do plan to read the others once I get back into reading through the Immortal books in March of next year. So I'm in my break month right now of December, where I just kind of read some of the books from my to-be-read pile. And then in January and February of 2026, I will start by reading straight through the Bible. I just start on page 1 and I read to the end of Revelation, and that usually takes right at 2 months. So I'll be back in the great books, the Immortal books, in March again of 2026. So I'll start right back up with these Pre-Socratics and Sophists again. So I'm looking forward to that, and I really think this is going to help me when I go back into Plato, which I'll do after I read the Pre-Socratics and the Sophists. It was just so interesting to consider what the beginning of philosophy would be like, or what it would look like. What kind of questions were they asking? What were they thinking? Like, how were they answering those questions? And then to be able to look at this 2,500 years later and ask, what did they get right? What did they get wrong? And I really enjoyed reading through this work. As for what's next, so I'm in my December list here, and here's what I plan to read during December. It's a lot, but I'm going to try to get through these. It's kind of a mix of books that have come up, and then just books that have been released by friends, and ones that I want to read on that front. So the first is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I'm reading a version that has other Christmas stories as well in that book. And so there's A Christmas Carol, and then there's 4 other stories. I finished The Christmas Carol, really enjoyed it. I'm leading a discussion on that next week for a book group. And then I started in on the second short story, and it's about goblins that live in the bell tower of a church. And I'm enjoying that one so far. So I love these short stories. I don't know if I'll read all of those other ones, just because I've got a number of other works I want to get through here in December. After that, I'm reading a book that is attributed to Cicero, and I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's in Latin, but it's the title is. But it has to do with memory and how to remember things, and it's something of interest to me, especially in the area of how do you remember what you read. And so I'm picking that one up and looking forward to reading that. After that, I'm going to read a book called The Real Environmentalists by Jim Beach. Jim Beach was a teacher of mine in grad school. He's an entrepreneur, and so he taught entrepreneurship and had a huge impact on the direction of my life and career. So I saw this book come out, and I wanted to read it. After that, The Last Economy by Emad Mostak. And a friend of mine recommended this book just as a good kind of what's going on right now in the world of technology. After that, The Secret Society of Success by Tim Schurer. And he is a local author here. I met him at one of our kids' birthday parties, and we got to talking, and he told me about this book that he had written, so I wanted to read that. After that, Living the Braveheart Life by Randall Wallace. Braveheart's one of my favorite movies of all time, and I met Randall Wallace earlier this year at a book event, got to talk to him a little bit, and so I thought it'd be fun to read his book. After that, Maria Scarf. This is by a man named Zorro, who is the drummer for Lenny Kravitz, and he's also a local author here, and I've gotten to know Zorro a little bit. And neat man, this is about the story of his upbringing. If I can make it to it, I've got one last book called When Bad Things Happen to Bad People by Tim Story. Tim is a friend who lives in the UK, and my wife and I just stayed at his house earlier this year, and he was telling me about this book that he had written. So I thought, I loved the premise of it. So we always hear when bad things happen to good people, but this one is when bad things happened to bad people. So I think it'll be a fun read. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you. You can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. You can also comment on this podcast episode in Substack. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter, and check out the website. I've got my reading lists from 2017 to 2025. I have my great books, my Immortal Books reading list up there of the 200 authors that I plan to read through for this reading project. I'll be back next week with another book that I've read for this year, 2025. Till then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.